She divorced poor driver to marry his boss, not knowing he just won $1 billion from. Then this happened. This is a story about what happens when someone mistakes silence for weakness and patience for defeat. I've watched people make decisions in moments they thought were private, decisions that shaped years they couldn't take back. This is one of those stories, and I'm telling it because I think the questions it raises are worth sitting with, even if the answers are uncomfortable. Here is a question I want you to answer at the end. If you gain everything you thought you wanted but lose the respect of the person you used to be, what have you actually won? Before we begin, let us know where you are watching from. Are you watching from New York, Los Angeles, or Dublin? And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. Caleb used to own a logistics company. Not a large one, but respectable, the kind of business built on relationships, not venture capital. He had employees who trusted him, contracts that renewed year after year, and a reputation for being fair even when it cost him. Then a series of decisions, some his, some beyond his control, brought it all down. A delayed shipment. A client who didn't pay. A loan that came due at exactly the wrong time. Within 18 months, the company was gone and Caleb was looking for work. He found it driving for a man named Landon Mercer. Landon ran a mid-sized corporate consultancy, the kind of firm that charged clients for strategic advice Landon himself rarely delivered. He had a rotating staff of analysts who did the actual work, a downtown office with glass walls and motivational art, and a carefully curated online presence that suggested success without specifying what kind. Landon needed a driver because he believed successful people didn't drive themselves. Caleb needed income because his savings were gone and his pride wasn't worth more than his mortgage. The job was simple. Caleb picked Landon up in the morning, drove him to meetings, waited in parking garages and outside restaurants, and drove him home at night. Landon didn't mistreat him exactly. But he also didn't speak to him the way you speak to someone whose dignity you recognize. Instructions were brief. Gratitude was absent. Caleb was furniture that moved. Brielle, Caleb's wife, watched this transformation with something colder than sympathy. They'd been married for 6 years. In the beginning, she'd admired his work ethic, his calm under pressure, his refusal to cut corners. But admiration is not the same as attraction, and when the company collapsed, something in her shifted. She didn't leave immediately. She stayed through the job search, through the first months of driving, through the quiet dinners where Caleb tried to reassure her that this was temporary, that he had plans, that he was working on something. But her eyes had already moved past him. She started noticing Landon. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow accumulation of small observations. The way Landon carried himself. The way people deferred to him. The ease with which he made decisions that affected other people's lives. Brielle had grown up without much, and she'd spent her 20s trying to build a version of herself that felt secure. Caleb had seemed like part of that plan once. Now he seemed like evidence that she'd aimed too low. There was a night, about 4 months into Caleb's employment, when Brielle joined Landon and a few of his associates for dinner at a downtown steakhouse. Caleb drove them. He waited outside for 2 hours, parked under a streetlight with the engine off, reading a book he'd borrowed from the library. When they came out, Brielle was laughing at something Landon had said. She didn't look at Caleb when she got into the car. Landon did though. Just for a moment. A glance that communicated everything. Ownership, amusement, and a kind of dismissive curiosity. Caleb saw it. He didn't say anything. Brielle started dressing differently. Not dramatically, just slightly more polished, more deliberate. She started asking Caleb questions about Landon's schedule, his preferences, his business. Caleb answered because he didn't yet understand what the questions meant. Or maybe he did and he was hoping he was wrong. He prayed more during this time. Not loudly, not in a way anyone would notice. But in the mornings before he picked up Landon, and at night after Brielle had gone to bed, Caleb would sit in the small office in their apartment, the one that used to be his workspace when he ran the company, and he would ask God for clarity. Not for wealth, not for revenge, not even for his marriage to survive if it wasn't supposed to. Just for the strength to do the next right thing, whatever that was. Brielle didn't pray. She planned. If you're still watching, comment "I'm still here" and hit the like button. Landon, for his part, was aware of Brielle's interest. He didn't pursue it immediately because Landon understood timing. He understood that people make decisions they can justify more easily than decisions they have to defend. So he waited. He created opportunities. Small comments about Caleb's situation, delivered with just enough sympathy to seem kind. Observations about how difficult it must be for Brielle, phrased as concern. Suggestions that she deserved better, framed as respect. One afternoon, Landon asked Caleb to drive him to a property he was considering purchasing. It was a house in the suburbs, far larger than anything Caleb and Brielle could afford. Landon walked through it slowly, narrating his thoughts aloud, the renovations he'd make, the gatherings he'd host, the kind of life that happened in spaces like this. Caleb waited by the car. When Landon came out, he looked at Caleb and said, "You ever think about what you'd do if you had another shot?" Caleb said, "Every day." Landon nodded, but not in a way that suggested he'd heard the answer. He got into the car and didn't speak for the rest of the drive. That night, Brielle told Caleb she wanted a divorce. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sat across from him at their kitchen table and explained, in calm and measured language, that she didn't see a future for them anymore. That she'd given him time to rebuild and he hadn't. That she needed to think about her own life, her own stability, her own happiness. She said she hoped he understood. She said she wished him well. Caleb asked if there was someone else. Brielle hesitated, but only for a second. She said, "That's not the point." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't beg. He asked her to give him a week to find another place to stay, and she agreed. They divided their possessions with the kind of efficiency people use when they're trying not to feel anything. The next morning, Caleb picked up Landon as usual. He drove him to 3 meetings, waited outside a lunch that ran long, and drove him home. Landon didn't mention the divorce. Caleb didn't bring it up. What Brielle didn't know, what no one knew, was that Caleb was still driving for a reason. The divorce was finalized in 6 weeks. Brielle moved out of their apartment and into a place closer to downtown, a 1-bedroom with exposed brick and high ceilings that she posted about on social media with captions about new beginnings. Landon helped her move. Caleb heard about it from a mutual acquaintance who thought he should know, though he already did. Landon didn't fire Caleb immediately. That would have been too obvious, too cruel in a way that might have reflected poorly on him. Instead, he kept Caleb on for another month, during which time Brielle began appearing at Landon's office more frequently. She'd stop by with coffee or to meet him for lunch, or simply to be seen in proximity to his success. Landon introduced her to his colleagues as a friend. Within 2 weeks, everyone understood what kind of friend she was. Caleb watched this happen from the driver's seat. He saw Brielle get into the car with Landon, saw the way she touched his arm when she laughed, saw the way Landon looked at him in the rearview mirror with an expression that wasn't quite gloating but wasn't quite anything else either. Caleb didn't react. He drove where he was told to drive. He waited where he was told to wait. He collected his paycheck and deposited it into an account that was slowly emptying despite his efforts to live on as little as possible. At night, alone in the small studio apartment he'd rented on the other side of the city, Caleb sat at a desk he'd assembled himself and stared at a laptop that was 6 years old and struggling. He didn't watch television. He didn't scroll through social media. He read, mostly, books about business, about patience, about faith. And he prayed, though the prayers felt increasingly like speaking into a void. There were moments during this time when Caleb questioned everything. Not his faith exactly, but his understanding of how faith was supposed to work. He tried to do things right. He built his business honestly. He treated people fairly. He'd loved his wife. And all of it had collapsed anyway in a sequence of events that felt both random and targeted, like the universe had decided to test him and then forgotten to send the results. But he didn't stop praying. He didn't stop showing up. Do share this with someone who must watch this and remember to like and subscribe. Landon, meanwhile, was beginning to integrate Brielle into his life with the kind of casual confidence people have when they believe they've won something. He took her to dinners with clients, introduced her to his network, bought her gifts that were expensive enough to signal commitment without actually being commitments. Brielle received all of this with visible gratitude. She posted photos of restaurant interiors, of wine glasses catching light, of herself in dresses she couldn't have afforded a year ago. She was building a new identity, and it looked like everything she'd wanted. Caleb saw these posts because he hadn't unfollowed her. He told himself it was because he didn't care enough to bother, but that wasn't true. He looked because some part of him needed to see what he'd lost, needed to measure the gap between where he was and where she'd gone. It didn't make him feel better. But it made him feel something, and during that period feeling anything was better than the numbness that threatened to settle in. 1 month after the divorce was finalized, Landon called Caleb into his office. It was late afternoon and the building was mostly empty. Landon sat behind a desk that was too large for the room, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up in a way that was meant to suggest he'd been working hard. He told Caleb that he was restructuring his operations, that he was moving toward a model that didn't require a full-time driver, that he appreciated Caleb's service but wouldn't be needing it anymore. He handed Caleb an envelope with 2 weeks severance and a reference letter he'd already written. The letter was polite, professional, and entirely impersonal. Caleb took it without reading it. Landon said, "I hope there are no hard feelings." Caleb said, "No, there aren't." And that was true. Caleb didn't feel anger in that moment. He felt something closer to relief, though he couldn't have explained why. He walked out of Landon's building for the last time, got into his car, a 12-year-old sedan that he'd kept running through a combination of stubbornness and online repair tutorials, and sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes. He didn't cry. He didn't punch the steering wheel. He just sat there in the fluorescent silence, and let himself acknowledge that this chapter was over. Then he drove home, parked on the street outside his building, and climbed the stairs to his studio. He made a sandwich he didn't really want, ate half of it standing at the counter, and opened his laptop. There were 17 unread emails. Most of them were automated, bills, promotional offers, newsletters he'd never subscribed to. But one near the bottom of the list had a subject line that made him stop. It read, "Acquisition notification, patent transfer completion." Caleb stared at it for a long time before he clicked. The email was from a law firm Caleb had worked with 7 years earlier, during the early days of his logistics company. Back then, he developed a software system for route optimization. Nothing revolutionary but effective enough that a few of his competitors had noticed. One of them had approached him about licensing the technology. Caleb had declined, not because he thought he could build an empire around it, but because he didn't want to give away something he'd created. Instead, he'd filed for a patent, more as a precaution than a strategy. Then his company had collapsed and he'd forgotten about it. The email explained that a consortium of logistics and technology firms had been quietly acquiring patents related to supply chain automation. Caleb's patent, dormant for years, had been identified as foundational to a system they were building. They tracked down the ownership, confirmed that Caleb still held it, and made an offer. The offer had been sitting in escrow for 6 months, waiting for Caleb to respond to notifications sent to an email address he no longer checked regularly. The acquisition price was $1.1 billion. Caleb read the number 3 times. Then he read the entire email again, looking for the mistake, the misplaced decimal, the phrasing that would reveal this was a scam. But the law firm was real. The consortium was real. The patent number matched the one he'd filed. Everything was real. There were conditions. The consortium required operational oversight during the integration phase, which meant Caleb would need to participate in the rollout, attend meetings, provide input on implementation. The contract also included a clause requiring confidentiality until the technology launched publicly, which was projected to happen in 18 months. He couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't change his lifestyle in a way that would draw attention. He couldn't make any major financial decisions without consulting the legal team. The money would be held in a structured trust. He'd have access to a modest monthly draw for living expenses, but the bulk of it would remain locked until the public launch. The contract was 43 pages long, dense with legal language and contingency clauses, and it required his signature within 10 days. Caleb sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his studio apartment. The paint was cracked in one corner. The light fixture buzzed faintly. He could hear his neighbor's television through the wall. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel vindication. He felt something stranger, something like vertigo, like the ground had shifted beneath him and he hadn't fallen but wasn't entirely standing either. He thought about Brielle, who had left because she couldn't see a future with someone who drove other people to their destinations. He thought about Landon, who had taken his wife and his job and treated both as if they were prizes he'd earned. He thought about the last 6 months, the humiliation and the silence and the nights when he prayed for clarity without knowing what clarity would look like. And then he thought about the clause that required him to stay quiet, to keep living exactly as he had been, to let the world continue seeing him the way it saw him now. He signed the contract that night. He didn't tell anyone. Not his parents, who lived 3 states away and called once a month to check on him with voices full of worry they tried to hide. Not the few friends who'd stayed in touch after the divorce, who texted occasionally to see if he wanted to meet for coffee or a drink. Not his landlord, who'd been patient about late rent payments but whose patience was clearly finite. Caleb went to bed that night in the same studio apartment, in the same second-hand bed, with the same cracks in the ceiling. And when he woke up the next morning, he made coffee in the same cheap pot, ate cereal from the same chipped bowl, and got ready to start looking for a new job. Because nothing had changed. And everything had. Landon Mercer received the confidential corporate alert at 7:43 the following morning. He was in his home office, scanning emails before his first meeting, when a message from his corporate intelligence service appeared. The service was something he paid for monthly, a tool that tracked mergers, acquisitions, patent transfers, and executive movements in industries adjacent to his consulting work. It helped him identify opportunities, anticipate market shifts, and occasionally poach talent before his competitors noticed it. This particular alert flagged a major acquisition in the logistics technology sector. A consortium had purchased a foundational patent for supply chain automation. The alert listed the key stakeholders, the projected market impact, and the name of the patent holder who'd just become a billionaire. The name was Caleb Donovan. Landon read it twice. Then he opened a secondary database and cross-referenced the patent number. The filing date was 7 years old. The original application listed a small logistics company that no longer existed. The current owner of record was the same man who'd been driving him around for the last 6 months. Landon sat very still. He pulled up the acquisition details. $1.1 billion. Structured trust. Confidentiality agreement. Operational oversight role. The consortium included 3 of the largest players in automated supply chain management, and they were projecting the technology would be integrated into systems affecting nearly 40% of North American logistics operations within 5 years. Landon's first thought was that this had to be a mistake. His second thought was that if it wasn't a mistake, he needed to verify it immediately. His third thought was that Caleb had known, had to have known, and had said nothing. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "I need you to pull every document associated with a patent transfer that closed yesterday," Landon said. "Logistics tech. Automation systems. Owner is Caleb Donovan." His lawyer said, "I'll have something by this afternoon." "What's this about?" "Just get me the documents," Landon said, and ended the call. He stood up and walked to the window of his office, which overlooked a stretch of the city that looked impressive in certain light and generic in most others. He was trying to reconstruct the last 6 months, trying to remember if Caleb had ever mentioned the patent, ever hinted at what was coming. But there was nothing. Caleb had been silent, obedient, unremarkable. He'd driven where he was told to drive. He'd waited where he was told to wait. He'd accepted his firing with the kind of quiet resignation Landon had interpreted as defeat. Landon felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. It wasn't quite panic, but it was close. He'd built his career on reading people, on identifying who had power and who didn't, on positioning himself advantageously in relation to both. And he'd been wrong. Completely humiliatingly wrong. He called Brielle. She answered on the third ring, her voice still rough with sleep. "It's early," she said. "Did Caleb ever mention a patent?" Landon asked. There was a pause. "What?" "A patent. Technology he developed. Anything related to logistics or automation." "I don't. Why are you asking me this?" Landon exhaled slowly. "Because your ex-husband just sold something for over $1 billion, and I need to know if you knew anything about it." The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that Landon thought the call had dropped. Then Brielle said very quietly, "That's not possible." "It's already done," Landon said. "The transaction closed yesterday." Brielle didn't respond. Landon could hear her breathing, could almost feel the recalibration happening in real time. "He didn't tell me," she said finally. He never said anything." "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure." Her voice was sharper now, defensive. "If he'd had that kind of money coming, don't you think he would have mentioned it? Don't you think he would have?" She stopped. Landon waited. "He wouldn't have let me leave," Brielle finished, but her voice had lost its certainty. Landon didn't argue with her. He told her he'd call her later and hung up. Then he sat back down at his desk and stared at the alert on his screen. The name. The number. The small, unignorable fact that the man he'd dismissed, the man whose wife he'd taken, the man whose dignity he'd casually eroded for 6 months, now controlled a technology that could reshape an entire industry. And Caleb had said nothing. Brielle stood in the kitchen of her apartment, still holding her phone, staring at nothing. The apartment was quiet. Sunlight was beginning to filter through the blinds, casting lines across the countertop. She'd chosen this place because it felt like progress, like the kind of space a woman who'd made the right decision would live in. Modern. Clean. Hers. Now it felt small. She tried to remember if Caleb had ever mentioned the patent. There were vague memories of him talking about the software he'd built, about filing paperwork, about possibilities that never materialized. But that had been years ago, back when she still believed his optimism meant something. She'd stopped listening at some point. She'd stopped asking. She opened her social media and scrolled back through her own posts. Photos of dinners with Landon. Photos of new clothes, new places, a new version of herself. The captions were full of words like growth, and self-worth, and choosing me. She'd meant them when she wrote them. She still meant them, she thought. But looking at them now, they felt like something else. Like evidence of a decision she'd made too quickly, based on information she hadn't bothered to verify. She thought about calling Caleb. She thought about texting him, something casual, something that didn't reveal how much Landon's call had shaken her. But what would she say? Congratulations? I heard? I didn't know? She put her phone down and made coffee she didn't drink. Across the city, Caleb was sitting in a cafe near his apartment, filling out job applications. He'd been there since 8, working through a list of delivery companies, warehouses, logistics firms, anywhere that needed drivers or coordinators or anyone willing to work irregular hours. The monthly draw from the trust was enough to cover rent and food, but it wasn't enough to feel secure. And Caleb had learned over the last year that security wasn't about having enough money. It was about knowing you could survive the next disruption. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. It was short, "We need to talk." Landon. Caleb stared at it for a moment. Then he deleted it and went back to his applications. Landon didn't give up. Over the next 3 days he sent 4 more texts and 2 emails. Each one was phrased slightly differently: concern, curiosity, professional courtesy, but the intent was the same. He wanted confirmation. He wanted access. He wanted to know how much Caleb knew and what Caleb planned to do with it. Caleb didn't respond to any of them. On the 4th day, Landon showed up at Caleb's apartment building. He waited in the lobby until Caleb came home from a job interview that hadn't gone well. Caleb saw him through the glass doors and stopped on the sidewalk. For a long moment, they looked at each other. Then Caleb walked inside. Landon stood up. "I just want to talk," he said. "I don't," Caleb said and walked past him toward the stairs. Landon followed. "You can't just ignore this." Caleb stopped on the 2nd step and turned around. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can." "I know about the acquisition," Landon said. "I know what you sold. I know what it's worth." Caleb didn't react. "And I know you have a role in the integration," Landon continued. "Which means you're going to need people. Consultants. Support. I can help you with that." Caleb almost smiled. "No," he said. "You can't." "You don't have to make this personal," Landon said. "It's not personal," Caleb said. "It's just over." He turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Landon standing in the lobby alone. That night, Landon called Brielle again. She answered, but she didn't sound like herself. Her voice was flat, distracted. "Did you try talking to him?" she asked. "He won't respond," Landon said. "Then maybe you should stop trying." Landon frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Brielle was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know what anything means anymore." She hung up before he could respond. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Caleb signed the acquisition contract. The consortium's legal team had been coordinating logistics, but they'd made it clear that Caleb's presence wasn't optional. This was the formal introduction of the technology to the stakeholders who'd funded it, and Caleb, as the patent holder and operational consultant, needed to be there. The meeting was held in a conference room 40 floors above the city, in a building Caleb had driven past hundreds of times but never entered. He arrived early, dressed in a suit he'd owned since his company was still running, slightly outdated, slightly tight in the shoulders but clean and presentable. He checked in with the receptionist, who directed him to the elevator with the kind of professional courtesy that didn't include curiosity. The conference room was larger than his entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the downtown grid. There was a table long enough to seat 20 people, though only 12 chairs were occupied when Caleb walked in. He recognized a few of the faces from photos and press releases: CEOs, board members, the kind of people whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. And at the far end of the table, looking smaller than Caleb had ever seen him, was Landon Mercer. Caleb stopped in the doorway. The lead attorney from the consortium stood up and gestured to an empty chair near the head of the table. "Mr. Donovan," he said. "Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." Caleb walked to the chair. He didn't look at Landon. He didn't need to. He could feel the eyes on him from every direction: curiosity, appraisal, confusion from those who hadn't yet been briefed on who he was or why he mattered. The attorney opened a folder and began the presentation. He explained the patent, the technology, the projected integration timeline. He detailed the market impact, the competitive advantages, the revenue models. He spoke for 20 minutes, and when he finished, he turned to Caleb. "Mr. Donovan has agreed to serve as the primary operational consultant during the integration phase. the attorney said. His expertise will be critical to ensuring the system functions as designed. We've structured his role to include final approval on all technical implementations. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, leaned forward. Final approval, she repeated. That's unusual for an external consultant. Mr. Donovan isn't external, the attorney said. He's the patent holder. The technology is his. We've licensed it, but the architecture, the logic, the core functionality, all of that belongs to him. The woman looked at Caleb. And you've been involved in logistics technology for how long? 7 years, Caleb said. His voice was steady. I built the original system for my own company. It worked. That's why they want it. There was a pause. Then another board member, a man with glasses and a tablet he hadn't stopped checking, said, Your company no longer exists. No, Caleb said. It doesn't. Why not? Caleb could have listed the reasons. The delayed shipment. The client who didn't pay. The loan. The timing. But he didn't. He just said, because I made decisions that didn't account for things I couldn't control. I learned from them. The man with the glasses nodded slowly and went back to his tablet. The attorney continued the presentation. He outlined Caleb's compensation structure, the oversight mechanisms, the benchmarks that would trigger additional phases of the rollout. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said, We've also retained Landon Mercer's consulting firm to provide strategic support during the transition. Caleb looked up. Landon was staring at the table. His expression was carefully neutral, but Caleb could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were folded too tightly in front of him. Mr. Mercer's firm has experience in corporate restructuring and change management, the attorney said. However, all strategic decisions will require Mr. Donovan's approval before implementation. Landon's head came up. He looked at the attorney, then at Caleb. There was a question in his eyes, shock maybe or disbelief, but he didn't ask it out loud. The attorney moved on. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Contracts were reviewed. Timelines were debated. Caleb answered questions when they were directed at him, but mostly he listened. When it was over, people stood, shook hands, collected their materials. Caleb stayed seated until the room was nearly empty. Landon was still there. He walked over slowly, stopping a few feet from Caleb's chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You knew, Landon said finally. The whole time. You knew. Caleb looked at him. Yes. And you didn't say anything. No. Why? Caleb stood up. He wasn't taller than Landon, but he felt it in that moment. Because it wasn't your business, he said. And because I didn't owe you an explanation. Landon's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the angle. You're still on the team, Caleb said. Your firm is still contracted. But you'll report to me. And if you can't do that with professionalism and respect, you can walk away right now. Landon stared at him. You think this is about revenge? No, Caleb said. I think this is about doing the work. If you can do the work, we'll be fine. If you can't, that's your choice. He picked up his folder and walked toward the door. Landon didn't follow. Brielle found out about the board meeting from a mutual acquaintance who worked in corporate communications. The acquaintance didn't have details, just that Caleb had been seen entering a high-rise downtown, dressed in a suit, and that someone in the building had recognized him and posted about it vaguely on a professional networking site. The post didn't mention the acquisition. It didn't mention the money. But it mentioned Caleb's name and the word, consultant, and that was enough. Brielle searched for more information. She found the consortium's press release, carefully worded to avoid specifics but confirming a major acquisition in logistics automation. She found Caleb's name listed as a technical advisor. She found estimates of the deal's value, none of which were confirmed but all of which were staggering. She sat in her apartment and tried to reconstruct the timeline. The patent had been filed before the divorce. The acquisition had closed after. Which meant Caleb had known, or could have known, that the deal was coming and he'd said nothing. He'd let her leave. He'd let her choose Landon. He'd let her build an entire new life based on the belief that he had nothing to offer. She called him. The call went to voicemail. She called again. Same result. She sent a text. I heard about the meeting. Can we talk? He didn't respond. She tried once more later that night. I know I don't have a right to ask, but I need to understand. Please. The reply came 3 hours later. It was short. There's nothing to understand. You made a choice. I respect it. I hope you're happy. Brielle read the message over and over, looking for anger, for bitterness, for anything that would give her a foothold. But there was nothing. Just politeness. Just distance. Just the kind of finality that comes when someone has moved on so completely that even resentment would require more energy than you're worth. She didn't text back. Landon, meanwhile, was unraveling in smaller, quieter ways. He still showed up to the consortium meetings. He still delivered reports and attended calls. But the authority he'd built his career on was gone. Every decision he made had to be approved by Caleb. Every strategy he proposed had to be reviewed. And Caleb, to Landon's growing frustration, didn't reject things out of spite. He rejected them because they weren't good enough. Because they didn't account for the people who'd be affected. Because they prioritized optics over outcomes. Landon had built a career on optics. 3 months into the integration, Landon submitted a restructuring proposal that would have streamlined the rollout by cutting a third of the logistics staff and automating their roles immediately. It was efficient. It was cost-effective. It was exactly the kind of move that won approval from boards focused on quarterly returns. Caleb rejected it. "This doesn't account for retraining," Caleb said during the review meeting. "You're cutting people without giving them a pathway to the jobs the system will create. That's not restructuring. That's just cruelty with a budget attached." Landon's jaw tightened. "The system will create new jobs. Just not for everyone." "Then we build a transition program," Caleb said. "We phase the automation. We give people time to adapt. We do it in a way that doesn't destroy lives to save quarters." "That's going to slow us down," Landon said. "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." The proposal was sent back for revision. Landon didn't argue. He went back to his office, closed the door, and stared at his computer screen for 20 minutes without typing anything. Then he opened his email and drafted a resignation letter. He didn't send it. Instead, he revised the proposal. He added the transition program. He phased the automation. He built in retraining pathways and extended timelines. It wasn't what he would have done on his own. But it was what Caleb required, and Landon was beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. When he submitted the revised proposal, Caleb approved it without comment. Brielle, during this time, was struggling in ways she didn't know how to name. She hadn't left Landon. But the relationship had changed. Landon was distracted, irritable, less interested in the public displays of affection and success that had defined their early months together. He stopped inviting her to dinners with clients. He stopped posting about their relationship. When she asked him what was wrong, he said, "Nothing," in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. She started spending more time alone. She'd scroll through her phone, looking at photos of her life from 6 months ago, before the divorce, before Landon, when she was still married to someone who prayed in the mornings and never raised his voice. She didn't miss Caleb exactly. But she missed the version of herself who hadn't yet made the choice that led here. One evening, she drove past the building where the consortium held its meetings. She didn't know why. She just found herself in the area, and the building was there, tall and impersonal and glowing in the dusk. She parked across the street and waited, though she didn't know what she was waiting for. An hour later, Caleb walked out. He was alone. He was carrying a folder and wearing the same outdated suit she'd seen him in 100 times before. He walked to his car, the same old sedan, still running, still unremarkable, and got in without looking around. He didn't see her. Brielle watched him drive away. Then she sat in her car for another 20 minutes, crying in a way that felt both justified and absurd, before she finally drove home. Landon lasted 6 more months with the consortium before he resigned. His letter, when it finally came, was professional and brief. He cited a desire to pursue other opportunities and thanked the team for the experience. Caleb read it, signed off on the transition plan, and didn't reach out. Brielle heard about Landon's resignation through the same network that had first told her about Caleb's board meeting. By then, her relationship with Landon was already over. They'd ended things quietly, without drama, both of them too exhausted to pretend it had ever been what they'd wanted. Brielle moved into a smaller apartment. She took a job she didn't love, but that paid her bills. She stopped posting on social media about growth and new beginnings. One afternoon, several months after the launch, she saw Caleb at a coffee shop. He was sitting by the window reading a book, a half-empty cup beside him. He looked the same, calm, unremarkable, content in a way that didn't require an audience. She almost walked over. Almost said something. Almost tried to bridge the gap that had grown too wide to measure. But she didn't. She ordered her coffee, took it to go, and left without him noticing she'd been there. Later that night, she wrote him an email. It took her an hour to draft, and when she was done, it was only 3 sentences long. "I'm sorry for the way I left. I'm sorry for not seeing what mattered. I hope you're doing well. She sent it before she could change her mind. Caleb read it the next morning. He thought about responding. He even typed out a reply. Something kind, something that acknowledged her apology without reopening anything. But in the end he deleted it. Not out of anger, but because he understood that some chapters close for a reason, and trying to rewrite the ending doesn't change what the story was. He closed his laptop and went for a drive. Caleb still prayed. Not as desperately as he had during the worst months, but consistently. He prayed in the mornings before he started his day, and at night before he went to bed. He prayed for clarity, for patience, for the people he was trying to help. He didn't pray for wealth or success or vindication, because he'd learned that those things didn't require prayer. They required work and time, and a willingness to stay quiet when silence was the hardest thing you could choose. There were moments when he thought about the last conversation he'd had with Brielle. The way she'd framed the divorce as self-respect, as choosing herself. He didn't think she'd been entirely wrong. Caleb valued integrity even when it cost him everything. Brielle valued security, even when it required abandoning someone who'd never failed her. Landon valued control, even when it meant diminishing people to maintain it. And in the end, the one who could live with his choices was the one who'd made them in silence, without needing the world to see. I don't know if that's justice, but I know it's real. And I think it's worth asking yourself, if everything you've built were taken away tomorrow, your status, your relationships, your certainty about who you are, what would remain? And would it be enough? Because the answer to that question, more than anything else, determines the kind of story you're living. And whether it's one you can live with when it's over. Rate this story, is it 10 over 10? Thanks for watching.